and kia ora, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to come present the first round of results from the National Science Challenge project. So I just want to acknowledge the team, and Nick is actually in the audience, and we will talk a little bit more about what he's leading, which is one of the next steps. So if you notice, like Andrea mentioned, we are a multi-agency team, but we're also interdisciplinary. So we have social scientists, geneticists, and ecologists in there, which I think is the way to go forward. When you're working with novel technologies, you want the social scientists in there with the biologists, the ecologists, so that we can work together to understand how to engage the community on these new technologies. So I think it's a really smart team that we've put together. And just so you understand, obviously we sit within the Biological Heritage Program, and we're in the Reducing Risks and Threats. So you might have heard about Predatorfree 2050. It's one of the new initiatives that was launched a year ago. It recognizes that current methods that we're using for pest control aren't sufficient, and that we'll really have to look to new technologies or novel technologies to achieve that goal. The ones that we're going to look at today and are the focus of our research are gene drive and Trojan female, which I'll give the elevator pitch on, and then a species-specific toxin. And again, just reiterating, it's a National Science Challenge funded project. We're 2 calendar years. We started in January of this year, so we've just finished the first year. We're the first fully social science funded project, but I recognize that many, if not all, of the National Science Challenge projects often have social science elements. But we really take this as recognition and applaud the National Science Challenge for recognizing that understanding what people think of novel technologies is absolutely essential. Just because a scientist can develop it, it doesn't mean the public needs or wants it. And so really it's essential to do the social research before we continue with the biological or ecological or genetic research. One of my colleagues who's a geneticist in Australia said this to me: I don't want to spend the next 10 years of my life trying to perfect gene drive, sitting in my lab and pipetting, to emerge a decade later, throw off my lab coat and go, ta-da, I've got gene drive sorted. For the public to go, we didn't ask for it and we don't want it. So at the heart of this research is understanding bumpers to put in the road and how New Zealanders think about these novel technologies in 2017. We hope that it serves as a baseline, but more importantly provides insight into novel technologies and scientific conversations in general that should be had with the nation. I just want to recognize that there's many funders to this particular project that I'm talking about, and there's also Mātauranga Maori that will be emerging from this research. I will not be speaking about that today. As you can see, my colleagues Mel, Amanda, and Ocean are the leads on that, so they will be working on that aspect. So, novel technologies, why don't we just tell people the facts? Well, let's say, sadly, you've just been diagnosed with heart disease, and you've gone into the doctors, and he or she says, we can do the normal course of treatment, but I think we should try nanotechnology. Your general response over a population would be, nanotechnology? Some people would say, I don't know what it is, sign me up for it. And some people would be like, nope, don't want it. We would fall into a bell-shaped curve with our initial response. This is known as the diffusion of innovation curve with novel things. It's been shown over and over again. When new technologies are introduced to society, we get a bell-shaped distribution. Most of us sit in the middle and go, don't know anything about it. There's the few early adopters. Those are the people that wait at 3 a.m. in line for their new Apple iPhone. And then you also have on the other side of the spectrum those people that just won't adopt anything new. It's not right or wrong, that's just how people are. What happens when we give them the information? So your doctor says, oh, nanotechnology, we're going to inject little robots into your body. So just a little snippet, factual information, actually leads to this. Those of us that sit in the middle actually become less supportive with just a little bit of information. This has been shown over and over again overseas in nanotechnology, synthetic bio, agrotechnology, you name the technology. It's been shown over and over again. And psychologists, we're not really too surprised by this, Because psychologists understand that most of us make decisions. In psychology, we call it heuristics, rules of thumb. You know it as your heart and your gut. So more information, providing people with facts, does not lead to greater acceptance. As you can see, it often leads to people becoming less accepting of it, because they're using their value system that they have developed over the course of their lifetime. So if you just provide society with more facts about novel technology, you end up with a polarization of society very quickly. And what happens when you get polarization is that people don't listen to the other side. And they actually start seeing it as sides. And they zing fact after alternative fact to the others, and it shuts down a conversation so that people actually don't engage in a dialogue about it. They've made a quick decision, and you've polarized the nation over those topics. I'm sure there's numerous topics that you can think of where society has quickly polarized about the topic. So at the heart of our research is we want to prevent that polarization so that we can have what we call a values-based conversation. So that's the aim of the research I'm presenting to you today, is to understand what New Zealanders' opinions are towards novel technologies, but more importantly, to uncover the values and beliefs, their heart and their gut, that they're using to make these decisions. We also assume New Zealand is not one homogeneous group, so we're going to explore to see if there's natural clusters of New Zealanders that cluster together based on their values and their beliefs and their opinions towards these novel technologies. Demographics are out. I'm not going to speak about demographics at all. The reason is when you start talking about Pakeha males who are 54 that live in Gore, you start, and apologies to anyone from Gore, there's nothing wrong with Gore. See, as soon as I mention somebody from Gore, you start, snickering. And what happens is we start developing stereotypes. So we develop isms, sexism, racism, when we start talking about demographics. They're often called masking variables, and so we did collect them, but we're not going to talk about them. But someone's going to ask a question about them anyhow, so I'll talk about them when you ask those questions. So what did we do? So we conducted a massive online survey. So I'm going to be light on methodology, but if you want to know the details, I love methods and stats, so come talk to me. So you can look at that sample size, 8,200. Fantastic sample size. It was online, and we used Colmar-Brunton stratified across the census data so we could get a representation of New Zealand society. We also went for a minimum of 500 in each of the regions because we really want to give detailed insights reports to different regions because we think that's where the value is going to be. It was a 20-minute survey, big data set. It crashes my Excel when I try to open it. And it's all Likert scale, so it's quite good. So it's all quantitative data. So what did we look at? Again, pulling from the overseas literature when it comes to novel forms of technology, how people use science to make decisions, but also understanding the New Zealand context, we threw in a lot of variables. So the dependent variable was people's perceptions, their opinions towards novel forms of technology. And we measured that 3 ways, and I'll talk you through that. Again, I'll be light on these, but if you want to know the scientific constructs, happy to go into the details and give you the references for all of these. So we looked at environmental values because quite often a lot of the conversation when it comes to these novel forms of technology quickly are a linear assumption that if you care about New Zealand environment and you want New Zealand biodiversity to flourish, then we should look to new technologies. But the public isn't so linear. In fact, you are not so linear when you make your decisions. So we collected their environmental values, but what we hope to show is that they often fall very low in the prioritization list when people are making their decisions about the novel forms of technology. We also looked at their current pest control attitudes because what they think currently might influence what they think in the future. It may or may not. We looked at something which is called personal values. So again, not to delve into Psychology 101, but this is really essential. So research overseas, specifically in Europe, has shown that this scale called the PVQ, which has been used over and over again in the European social science field, has been shown that we, as all society people, have a wheel shape towards our personal values. And that really most of our decisions, regardless of the topic, are driven by our specific personal values. And your personal values are a wheel. It is neither right nor wrong. You cannot shift values. You're pretty much entrenched with your values by the time you become an adult. So I just want to reiterate, you cannot change people's values. You cannot. And so the values really look at two different spectrums. Are you open to new things? Do you explore new things, or are you steeped into tradition? And the other spectrum is, are you motivated by self-success, self-wealth, really about you, or are you more egalitarian? None of those values are right or wrong, and we need all representation for a healthy society. Similarly, we looked at people's societal values, because as we drew from overseas literature, how people view the society they live in, i.e., is New Zealand a just society? Do they feel that they are part of a just society? Really seems to influence how they view environmental issues. So really strong relationship between people wanting to keep a status quo in their society or wanting to drastically change it is really linked to climate change beliefs and behavior, and also broader environmental beliefs. So we threw those variables in too. We also looked in trust in organizations, because if you haven't realized it, it's often who's saying the message. It depends on how receptive the message is. We looked at New Zealand conservation beliefs. There's a study by my colleague every couple of years, Ken Huey, that uses some measures, so we adopted some of those measures to look at some of the issues that people believe about New Zealand. We also looked at conservation actions in New Zealand, so to really capture that New Zealand context, because we do think we're different from the US and Europe. And scientific knowledge. So this was really important. This was general scientific knowledge, so this was objective, true, false, or I don't know questions that have been used quite regularly overseas. And then we wrote specific ones to the New Zealand conservation context and pests in New Zealand too. Because one of my colleagues said, you know what we need? We just need everyone in New Zealand to take a genetics course, and then they would understand gene drive and get over it. And I thought, well, I don't think you're going to get that to happen, first of all, and two, that's not going to make a difference. So we threw this variable in to really sort of, again, reiterate that scientific knowledge often has very little relationship when people are making decisions based on scientific evidence. So let's talk about the 3 pest control methods. Is there a geneticist in the room? Would you like to give the elevator pitch of what gene drive and Trojan female are better than the psychologist who's giving the talk? Okay, great. Thanks. I appreciate that. So I'll give you the elevator pitch. I did have to dust off my graduate genetics book for this one. So gene drive is the concept that in the laboratory you would breed up the target species, rats, wasps, and you would genetically engineer, cut a gene that you want in all the individuals. So go back to basic genetics, you get Mendelian genetics, a 50-50 split. So an individual has offspring, 50% should get one gene and 50% should get the other. In gene drive, you copy and paste so that all offspring have the gene that you desire. In this particular case, we're going to select for maleness. So copy and paste so that all females, all their offspring are males. Overseas, they call this mamas who have boys. They don't refer to it as a gene drive. Kind of clever. So in theory, you would, in the laboratory, breed up rats, wasps, whatever the target species was, genetically engineer, and then release them into the wild. So over time, those individuals would breed and only have males, and the population crashes. Trojan female operates a little bit similarly. The end result is similar. However, in Trojan female, some females just naturally have infertile male offspring. So you would selectively breed again in the laboratory for females that have infertile males. They would have females too, but they would have infertile females. Again, release them into the wild so that they would breed. Their male offspring would be infertile. Their females would be okay. Their offspring that were females would go on, At the end of the day, you would only end up with females and infertile males, and the species would collapse. So that's the two concepts really in a nutshell. They're much more complicated than that. And then a pest-specific toxin is just that. There are several close-to-market ones that are being developed. We measured perception 3 ways, and this is really critical, and this is why you really should use social scientists. So that's not a plug for more staff, but you really should use social scientists. Because what happens is usually we measure it by just saying, gene drive, what do you think on a scale of 1 to 7? So that's gut reaction. So we did measure that. And then give them just a little bit more facts. So we did that, and that was the more factual description. So we again said, so on a scale of 1 to 7, here's the definition of gene drive. So Dan Tompkins, our geneticist, obviously worked with us to make sure everything we said was quite factual. But the more preferred method, do we have any economists in the room? Okay, so the more preferred, more accurate method, which is really trendy right now in the environmental field, but an economist will tell you it's been used for the last 30 years, is something called choice modeling. So choice modeling is really a clever way because we don't make decisions in black and white. It's usually context specific. So if I ask you, would you rather eat chocolate cake or pavlova? Your answer is probably, it depends. Is it Christmas or is it Easter? Who made the pavlova? Edie, was it you or was it my Nana? What did I eat for dinner last night? Am I going for a jog? Am I on a diet? So there's usually a lot of attributes, a lot of context that then decides whether you would want chocolate cake or pavlova. So we built upon that. And in choice modeling, we went and picked the different attributes that we think might be contributing to people's choices. And we did, before we ran the survey, do qualitative focus groups and cognitive testing to make sure we were on track. So we had 3 target species, rats, wasps, and stoats. The rats and wasps we picked through a social process, and stoats we threw in there for an alignment to another project. The 3 novel forms of technology, and then we also threw in the outcome, infertility or death. Because some historic research that DACA sits on shows that some opposition to current forms of pest control is because it's a toxin and results in death. 2 of the new forms, Trojan female and gene drive, can allow the individual to live out its natural life, but just not successfully breed. So we were curious to know how that would impact people's choice if the animal didn't die. So the humanity of the new forms of techniques. And then we looked at ground and aerial distribution, again to try and untangle current beliefs around current forms of techniques that are, is it the toxin, is it the aerial? And so what happens is when you do this, you offer people these questions, these scenarios, and they vote on the scenarios, and you mix and match those attributes out. Statistically, what you can do is using their weights, you can line them up to understand which attribute has greater support and lesser support. So a real clever way to start unpicking how people, what are people making their decision on. And you can also then look at the interactions of all these terms, which is even a neater way. So let's see if that, so here's an example of a choice model. This is not what was shown in the actual survey. We just couldn't take it from the actual survey, but it's real similar. So the target species is a wasp. So you're looking at choice A and choice B, and you're going to vote on them. And then you also always are given a third option, which is neither. You don't like either. So choice A is target species is a wasp. The control was via selective breeding that results in sterile male offspring, so that's Trojan female, and it was through aerial distribution. Do you like that one? Or do you prefer target species as a rat, control via poisoning, which results in death, and ground-based space station? So you'd be presented with that, vote on which one, or C, which is neither, and then we would mix and match and show you another question with the attributes mixed up. You vote on that, and we only statistically have to do that 6 times until we can get, then we can string it out and get the attributes lined up. So a real clever tool. So what did we find? So again, I'll be light on the method, the stats that we use, but happy to talk about that. It's a massive data set, so we're still in the midst of analyzing. So we used latent class analysis to look for clusters that would come together, and we had a nice fit, a nice model fit. 4 perspectives emerged. And what I want to reiterate is these are not people. We weren't putting people into boxes. Instead, these were like hats or ways people make decisions. So when I make decisions, I have core values that I use. So that's my heart and my gut that I use. But sometimes I wear different hats. Sometimes I'm a social science researcher from Doc, and I put on that hat. Sometimes I'm a mom, and I make decisions based on that hat. Sometimes I'm the PTA secretary, and I make those decisions. And sometimes I'm the co-president of the local soccer union, and I put on that hat. So my decisions might depend on the context, the hat I wear, but probably they're really aligned to the values, the shared values that I have. So as I present the perspectives, what you need to keep in mind is you probably fall in one dominant perspective, but there might be elements that trickle through of all four perspectives. So if you don't see yourself perfectly fitting in, that's okay. And what I love as a psychologist is these perspectives are messy. They're complicated. One of our colleagues, when we saw the initial results that came out of it in the room, said, "Oh, people, they're so confusing." And I said, I love it as a psychologist, because we are. This is why there's so many self-help books written, because we are complicated, confusing, irrationally, yet predictably irrational people. So let me show you what we found. First of all, just some of the hardcore facts that we found is that 61% of people had heard of Predatorfree 2050. So that project had only been launched a year ago, so that's pretty good. That's impressive. And the next three stats show you that New Zealand knows pest species are a problem to our biodiversity. So 84% agree pest species are a significant problem to conservation. 14% don't think we're doing enough. And 85% want future investment. So good job, everyone. Everyone that's been involved in conservation, biodiversity, the environment, people know pests are a problem. I don't think getting those numbers up to 90% would see society change anyhow. So don't focus on getting them to understand there's a problem. I think we're there. What we need to focus on is the future, how they want to move pest control forward, and more importantly, why they're making those decisions, and that's what this research will helpfully guide. So again, let's go back to some of the basic research results. So overall, what we've plotted here is on a scale of 1 to 7, we said, what do you think about gene drive? And on the far right-hand side, I have no concerns, and on the far left, it should never be used, and that's the number of respondents. What does that look like? Classic bell-shaped curve. Lovely. Now, we gave them the snippet of more information about what the definition of was gene drive. There's the results. Classic. I told you, right? This is what would happen. So this is fantastic. So what this means is that in New Zealand, we're making decisions about novel technologies in the pest context, similar to what overseas research is showing about how humans make decisions of any form of novel technology. So that's good news for me, because we can learn from overseas research about how communities and how governments have engaged different societies in novel forms of technology. Because sadly, there's only a lot of case studies of how badly they've done it. And so maybe we can learn in a positive way how to move things forward. So I think the research we're presenting can be a prototype for how to engage New Zealand on a lot of scientific issues. So let's go over the results a little bit more. So again, this is just presenting it in a table because most of you are scientists and you love your data. So again, I'll show you the 3 different forms. And what I'll just draw your attention to is that far right. So that's the aggregation of people, the respondents, who probably are okay with it. And what you notice, gene drive has about 32% of the people say, oh, we're okay with it. Trojan females, 42%, and pest-specific toxin is about 52%. So really interesting. And if you look at the far left of the percentage that says it should never be used. So overall, what we assume from this is that the nation hasn't made up their mind. And that's pretty fair because it's all really new techniques. So we're in a good place to start having that conversation with New Zealand. So then let's look at the attributes. So this is, again, quite interesting. This is the results from the choice modeling. If you've been around New Zealand for any bit of time, you're probably not surprised to see what falls up on the bottom. So from the air is the attribute that had the least support. This has major implications not only for our research, but anybody in the biosecurity field that probably would be looking at dealing with biosecurity incursions that might require an air response. It's a real issue with New Zealand. On the ground, obviously a strong, greater support for on the ground. But I want to draw your attention to the difference between Trojan female and gene drive. Look at that. So again, from some of the preliminary research that we did before running the survey, I can give you some insights into what possibly is going on. So when we did the pre-testing of the survey, we talked to the potential respondents and talked them through the techniques so that we could actually write the techniques up in a couple of paragraphs so that they would understand it. What could be is it could be a classic name thing. What do you think about Trojan female? I love it. I don't know anything about it, but it's a cool name. And so it could be just a name thing. It could be that gene drive has the G word in it, genetic. And it could be people are associating it with GMO and other gene things, and so that's how they're making the decision. Or a third alternative could be at the heart of the two techniques. Some of our respondents said, oh, Trojan female, that's more natural. You know, I grew up on a farm. I understand selective breeding. You find something you like and you just breed for it. So you're going to do it in the laboratory, but it's more natural. Whereas gene drive was genetically editing, and they said that's not natural. So what Nick and his team are doing is that they're running focus groups to try and explore and uncover those possible different ways people are making decisions about gene drive and Trojan female. So Nick's just recently finished some focus groups, and he'll run some more in January and February. What I was quite interested in, and I was personally surprised about, was the difference between death and infertility. I really thought it would be reverse. But this is a classic statistics 101. These are averages. What happens is infertility is people feel very strongly about it one way or the other, and you're just seeing that average. So that's going to become really clear when I start walking through the different perspectives. So what we found was 4 perspectives. Again, remember, they're hats, not people. The first perspective is a humanitarian perspective. Those who tend to hold this perspective really view the sanctity of all life, and they're hesitant towards current and future toxins because they result in death. And however, they're okay with future gene drive and Trojan female because it results in the animal living out its natural life. So I'm just going to give you a snippet of them and then talk you through each perspective a little bit more. The next group is an individualistic perspective. This group is very much making their decisions about their personal freedom. They are very skeptical of top-down initiatives and all government and every agency. And they only really trust things that they can learn themselves. The third group is a pragmatic perspective. They're okay with current forms of techniques, and they're okay with a pest-specific toxin, but they don't see the need for a technological leap. This group tends to be the least concerned from a conservation perspective, but they are very much about the pragmatic economic impact of pest control. And the fourth group is a scientific perspective. People in this perspective really see themselves as being evidence-based. They have a high trust in scientists, and they're okay with current forms of techniques. They're okay with a pest-specific toxin, but they are the group that would most likely choose 3 in the choice modeling, meaning I don't know, because they haven't made up their mind about gene drive and Trojan female because the science evidence isn't there, so they're taking a wait-and-see approach. So let me just walk you through the 4 perspectives a little bit more because you might find them quite interesting. So the first perspective has a strong connection. So this is that humanitarian perspective. They have a strong connection to nature. They really prefer replanting over pest control. They don't see pests as a major threat to New Zealand. Like I said, they're least accepting of toxins, primarily because of the humanity aspect of it. So they believe in the sanctity of all life. They see no difference between introduced species and indigenous species. So they don't want the death of anything. And again, they are more accepting of gene drive and Trojan female because of the humanity aspect. It allows those animals to live out their natural life. So they're strongly driven by the sanctity and the equity of all life, both humans and animals. And what's interesting is they have a mild distrust in almost all organizations, just a mild distrust, except for iwi leaders. And what I want to reiterate, or I didn't mention, but you're going to ask me about the demographics anyhow, even though I told you not to, is that there's no significant difference between Maori respondents in each of the 4 perspectives. So it's not because this perspective has greater Maori respondents. So that's quite interesting. So they really align and listen to iwi leadership. So the second one, the second perspective has a real strong, so this is that individualistic perspective, a strong relationship to nature, but they're not doing much in the conservation field. They have strong support for pest control trapping, but they're extraordinarily concerned about current, i.e. 1080 forms of, and the risks that come from current forms of pest control. They actually are really knowledgeable about the conservation, New Zealand conservation context and pest control. It's a real niche topic for them. So they have a real high knowledge in this area, but not in general scientific knowledge. So it's a real niche topic that they have educated themselves about. And like I said, or I didn't tell you actually, is that they have a low acceptance of current forms of technology, current forms of pest control, and also all future. So they wouldn't accept anything. So they're this group was the most likely, when you ask them, what do you think? They were like, nope. So they were really the ones to score things on a 1. This group, I want to reiterate, is highly characterized by extreme distrust of all organizations, especially government. They are very much focused on a very small in-group and are not likely to trust anyone from the out-group. And they're really driven by independence and autonomy and fairness, and they believe New Zealand society is not fair, and that's probably leading to their distrust of any government or top-down initiatives. The third perspective has a low connection to nature, but funny enough, they're actually the ones that are doing the most conservation actions. And this actually reiterates research that we've done recently up in Auckland. So I just want to point that out, that you can have a connection to nature, and what we are finding in our research and over again in other research is those people that say they're committed to conservation and care about New Zealand biodiversity sometimes are the ones doing the least. And in this research, those that actually have the lowest conservation concern actually were doing the most actions. The reason they're doing their actions are most likely for pragmatic implications. So not because of the positive impact on biodiversity, but economic or social impact. They have the lowest, so the whole conservation, so overall, New Zealanders are really well knowledgeable about the New Zealand conservation and biodiversity context, but this group was the lowest in all 4. They're not tremendously low, so it's not like they're not knowledgeable, but overall in comparison, it's not really on their radar. They have low support for Predatorfree 2050, and they have no, when it comes to different methods to move New Zealand forward in conservation, there was no difference between planting and pest control. They were like, nah, it's not really all that important. They had low scientific knowledge, but general trust in almost all organizations, with high trust in church and business leaders. So really interesting. So they're listening to church and business leaders. Ken?
Donald Trump.
They're more accepting of 1080 and new toxins because they see that it's worked. So we'll see the pragmatic implications of using 1080 currently. But they're, like I said, less accepting of the new techniques because they just don't think we need that scientific leap. And they're really driven by the economic perspective. So for them, it's about the economic impact of pest control. And the fourth perspective has an average connection to nature, but lower actions. They have strong scientific knowledge, both general scientific and New Zealand contexts about biodiversity and pest control. Strong support of Predator-Free 2050. They want more pest control. They have extreme trust in scientists. They're more accepting of 1080 and new toxins, but again, they haven't made up their decision about the new genetic tools. They have high trust in organizations and elected officials, so they're really open to listening to government initiatives. They're really driven by the evidence, from the scientific community. So what are we going to do with this research? Why did we do it? Well, one of the things that's really important for those of us that are in the scientific or conservation or environmental field to recognize which of the 4 perspectives we fall in. So when I presented this to doc staff, I asked, and probably about 80% of the hands went up to 4th perspective. So here's where it's necessary to have empathy for others. Too often, if you are in the 4th perspective, if you want to engage with other people, what do? You give them the scientific facts. And then they make their decision, but it's not based on the scientific facts. And so we then call them stupid or ignorant, and then that leads to that polarization. So remember I said if you just provide people with facts, you end up with that polarization. So if people are in the fourth perspective or leading programs to engage the nation, they're just filling out fact after fact after fact, and the other three perspectives aren't listening. So one of the first things we should do is recognize which perspective we come from so that we can have empathy and start to understand how to engage the other three perspectives. So we actually do this really well on a person-by-person individual level. If I have a neighbor and I want the tree to be cut down between our property, I don't just go up to my neighbor and go, cut down that tree. It's blocking my sun. You don't go straight for the fact. You go, hey, Andrea, what are you doing over Christmas? How's your dog? What are you doing? You know her and her values and what she cares about. And then you go, do you mind if we cut the tree down? It's been blocking the sun. And most often, she will say yes. She has the right to say no. Sometimes she says no, and then you have a dialogue about it. So on a person-to-person level, we always have a values-based conversation. But it seems when we have these new scientific initiatives, we go to make a poster that has all the facts or a website with all the facts. Those are absolutely necessary to have, but if that's what you only rely on, you're going to get that polarization of society. So in summary, people agree we have a problem with pests. So that's great. But the nation has not made up their mind about these novel forms of technology. But if we just rely on giving them the facts, those little snippets, you'll notice that bell-shaped curve instantly comes into a bimodal distribution. So giving people more facts or more information about the techniques will not convince them. And I just want to reiterate, the role of this research is not to convince at all. It's just to understand the value system. We live in a wonderful democratic society, and at the end of the day, if New Zealand says no to these new techniques, that is completely acceptable. New Zealand has a long, proud history of saying no to certain forms of novel techniques, i.e. nuclear is a great example. But what we want to do is try and use this research as a tool to elevate a conversation and to avoid that emotive bimodal distribution, so that we can have a conversation and then society can make a decision. So I just want to reiterate that research is not to try and convince or persuade people, nor is it to try and switch people from perspective, because you just can't do that. What we're advocating is we move forward with a values-based discussion so that we can align to what people care, so that people actually engage in a dialogue rather than a zinging of facts and facts across the aisle. What I love is that people are complex, and that we need to recognize that people are complex, and that people are making their decisions. If you notice from the research, most people are making their decisions, it has very little to do with their values towards conservation. It's their wider, broader social, personal value system that is driving their decision-making process. And we hope this research can inform other areas, not just novel pest control, but like biosecurity and other scientific conversations that should happen. So the next step is we've done a series of presentations. I think you're number 16 as it is. We are available on YouTube. If you want to see the project, you can just Google Cape to City, and this is being recorded right now. We hope to share these results as we finish them with the regional biosecurity, biodiversity, and communication tags, and that we'll have an insights report that details the results much more thoroughly, probably around March or April of next year, which we'll share very widely. And so those are the results. Then the next two aspects of research that we'll cover over the next 12 months, it's like I alluded to, Nick is running the focus groups to really understand the nuances of the perception. So we hope to have that work wrapped up in April. And then the third aim is we're really going to try and put our money where our mouth is and look at if we frame these messages aligning to the different perspectives of values, how does that impact people's opinions towards these techniques? So really seeing if you have that values-based conversation, how does that happen? What's the result of that? So that's the research. So I open up the floor for questions. Thank you.